Hello. In today's video, we are going to talk about identity and perception. More specifically, we are going to talk about self-concept, self-esteem, and identity, socialization and how it impacts those things, an impact of a poor and high self-concept and self-esteem on someone, identity management in terms of communication, and techniques and influences on perception. When you talk about somebody's self-concept and self-esteem and those types of dynamics, what we're really in terms of communication, what we're really referring to is intrapersonal communication. So what intrapersonal communication is communication that basically with yourself. So it's the communication that you have going on inside your head. It's the things that you tell yourself, right? And communication has like these various levels, and you can take whole courses in all of these. So you have intrapersonal, which is again communication in your head. You have interpersonal, which is sort of one-on-one communication, and we're going to certainly talk about dynamics of that in this video. Then you've got small group and organizational communication, so that's with 2 or more people, all the way up to public speaking and mass communication. So a lot of different levels, and they all, of course, influence each other in certain ways. But we're going to focus a lot in this video series on intrapersonal communication and interpersonal communication. So what is the impacts? Why does intrapersonal communication even matter? It has a really big influence on your self-concept, your self-esteem and identity, how you carry yourself around others, what is sort of the image that you project outward to people, and also your expectations and interpretations of events that happen to you. So an example would be, let's say you're going to a job interview and you're really confident. For a couple of reasons. One is you think you interview well, and you also think you're a really good applicant. They really should hire you for the job. They'd be lucky to have you, right? When you're in that interview, the person with that mindset, do you think that's gonna show? Do you think that's gonna come across? It probably is, right? Either verbally and non-verbally, in how they answer the questions and making eye contact, not showing signs of nervousness and things like that, right? And so that is an example of intrapersonal communication, your internal self-concept and self-esteem affecting how you're interacting with other people, right? And we can obviously think of the reverse side of that coin, to where somebody who is not confident, they don't think that they're likely to get the job. Maybe they don't think they interview well. And when they're in that interview, they're probably going to engage in verbal and nonverbal communicative behaviors that give off that impression, right? So it certainly affects how you carry yourself. In terms of interpretations and expectations of events, we're certainly going to go through some examples of that. But basically, where you see that come into play would be, let's say you ask somebody out, okay? You approach somebody that you're interested in, or you're hitting on them, or whatever it may be. And you're confident, like you think you're an attractive person, you think you have a good personality, right? You think you're a catch, right? You're easy on the eyes. If you're somebody who, for example, you have a high self-concept and self-esteem in those areas, right? And you approach somebody and they turn you down, right? You get rejected. How are you going to interpret that event? So the person who's really confident in themselves, they might look at that like nobody likes to be rejected, right? But they might look at that as, well, maybe they're just not attracted to me, right? Could be a lot of factors. It doesn't necessarily say anything about me. They're not necessarily going to take it personally, right? But now let's take the reverse. Let's take somebody who maybe is not as confident in themselves. Maybe they don't necessarily think they're that attractive, or they've gotten rejected a lot, and then they approach somebody and they get rejected. They're going to look at it as, well, here we go again, right? They're more likely to look at it that way, right? As, well, this just confirms what I already knew, which is that I'm not very attractive and people are not interested in me, right, romantically. And so it just affects how we interpret things. Or if you want to go back to that job interview setting, the person who's not confident and then they don't get hired, right? They're likely to interpret that as, well, see, here we go, right? Of course I didn't get hired. I'm not good at interviews, right? Or I'm not a good applicant. Nobody ever hires me, right? Now, are those interpretations rational and logical? Probably not, by the way, in a lot of ways. So, for example, the applicant who does not get hired, and then they say, well, see, I'm clearly not a good applicant. That's why they didn't hire me. I don't do well in interviews. It might have nothing to do with you, right? Like, let's just use basic logic and math. If a company interviews 20 people, if they interview 10 people, okay, and let's say you are an 8 out of 10 as an applicant, so you're pretty good. Well, there's 10 people they interviewed. So you already only have a 10% chance of getting hired, just based on if they're just going to hire from the people they interviewed from that poll, right? So already your odds are not good, regardless of how well you do in the interview. But let's say there were 3 other people or 4 other people that were also an 8. Even then, if you did well in the interview, you're an 8 and you showed you're an 8, that you're a really good applicant, the odds are they're still not going to hire you, right? If you're 1 out of 4, you still only have a 25% chance, right? But we tend to internalize that, our expectations meeting what our own self-concept was, even if it's not logical, right? Like in the interview setting. By the way, in the asking somebody out setting, that's also not illogical to internalize that. As we'll see, they're rejecting me. Clearly, I'm not attractive. That also doesn't make sense, right? If, again, just think about it for a minute. When you ask somebody out and they reject you or they don't return that mutual interest, if you think about it rationally, that really doesn't say anything about you or your attractiveness, right? Especially if they don't really know you that well, right? Because really what they're doing when they're not responding to you is really all they're doing is saying, essentially, you're not the kind of person I'm attracted to, right? It's not really anything about your overall attractiveness to other people. It's just for them, that's not what they're interested in, right? Or you're just not somebody they're interested in. It has nothing really to do with your just general level of attractiveness. So my point about those 2 examples is sometimes these internal interpretations and expectations, these perceptions, right, which we're going to talk about later, of outside events, they oftentimes are way off and not really reality, but we're internalizing them a certain way because of our self-concept and self-esteem going into the situation, right? And so sometimes in a really funhouse mirror warped way because we have a poor concept and self-esteem. So that's also why it really matters to care about your self-concept and your self-esteem, right? Because it's influencing all of these other dynamics, such as how you project yourself and how you interpret things. Okay, so self-concept, self-esteem, identity, these are actually different concepts. So let's get into what they are, okay? Because they kind of get used interchangeably, and they're not really interchangeable things. So they're related, but not the same thing. So self-concept is basically how you view yourself and think others perceive you. So this is essentially, what do you think is true about you? And what do you think other people think is true about you? Now, you're not judging this. You're not creating is this right or wrong? Is this good or bad? So it's sort of like saying, I'm like for me, it'd be like if I said, I'm a brother, I'm a son, I'm an instructor, I'm a lawyer, I'm an Atlanta Braves fan in baseball. It's like all the things that are true, right? I think if you think you're smart, if you think you're caring, if you think you're good at something, you have a certain skill set. It's just all these things that you just think are true, okay? Now, what your self-esteem is do you think those things are good or bad? Now, why this matters a little bit is because a little bit of that is in the eye of the beholder, if it's good or bad. But self-esteem is, are those things good? Okay, are they good, or are they right or wrong? Are they serving you well, or are they harmful, right? Now, identity, the third dynamic here, is basically the image that you put out to other people. So identity is, what do I want other people to think of me? Okay? Do I want them to think of me as smart? Do I want them to think of me as being good at this thing? Do I want them to view me this way? Okay? And and by the way, all 3 of them. So all 3 of these can be constructed internally and socialized. So what I mean by that is all 3 of them have dynamics that you just decide about you, right? And then all 3 also get influenced by what the world tells you about you, right? So again, go back to that example I just gave a minute ago. If whenever you ask people out or you sort of show interest in somebody, if you've gotten rejected your whole life, part of your belief on like how attractive you are, some of that comes from you, right? Your own sort of beliefs about you. But in terms of like your looks or personality or whatever it may be. But if the feedback you're getting from the outside world, the socialized part, right? If you constantly got rejected, you're probably not going to think you're very attractive, right? Because the feedback you tend to get is rejection. And vice versa, right? If you've always gotten the girl or always gotten the guy or whatever it may be, right? If every time you ask somebody out or show interest, you tend to date them, they say yes, you're going to think you're attractive, right? if you always got good grades in school, you're going to think you're smart, right? Because you're basically constantly getting the feedback that you're smart. So it's kind of, so that's the socialization dynamic, right? So that comes into play for all of these, like society telling you what you are. Also, sometimes, like in terms of identity. So remember, I said identity is what you put out to other people, what you want them to think of you, right? And we're going to talk in this video in this series about something called identity management, where you purposely are managing that, right? Now, the socialization part comes in there because that's basically what society tells you is, hey, what is the identity you should want to embrace, right? What should you want to put out there? And so all three of these get impacted in other ways. So going back here to self-concept, self-esteem, because we're going to kind of focus on that for the first part of our discussion here. So self-concept is, what do I think is true about me, whether it's good or bad or not. I just think it's true. It's just a fact. Self-esteem is, are these things good or bad? Now, this is in the eye of the beholder. And the reason I say that is because there are certain things that, depending on how you view it, kind of determines if it's good or bad. And really, for you, a little like, hey, life hack is maybe you should reevaluate. Like some of the things that you look at your life and you consider as bad, you can, reframe them as good things, right? That can be more useful to you, and seeing sort of the good in them. So that's what you have to keep in mind. So we're looking at this in the context of communication. And we're also, to give you an example of this in culture, since this series is focusing on communication and also culture and communication, let's look at this from the concept of like cultures and work habits. So there are some cultures, like American culture, for example, that were really big on this notion of you should want to have a really strong work ethic, and not just like a good work ethic as in when you're working you work hard, but you should want to like work all the time. Like there's something wrong with you if your life aspirations isn't to work 80 hours a week and be the CEO and just be the boss and, every day you're hustling, right? And hey, maybe there's benefits to that. Maybe there's something really good about that, right? You can make a lot of money, be uber successful. And that's not just about, having an awesome car and the beach house. Like, if you have a lot of money, you can do a lot of good things with that money, right? You can provide a fabulous life for yourself and for the people you love and you care about, right? There's going to be a lot of great things about that. But so if you perceive yourself as somebody who works a lot, you're always hustling, right? In American culture, we're usually, if you perceive that as true about you, it's in your self-concept, we're told that should be something you should feel good about and be proud of. So it should be it should lead to like a positive self-esteem, right? You give that the plus instead of the minus in terms of how you view it. But that's not true in every culture. For example, there's other cultures that promote more of a work-life balance, right? And in other words, there's other cultures where that's considered unhealthy, that you should prioritize self-care more or time with your family more. And obviously within American culture, right, there's subcultures, there's other groups that emphasize that, right, as being more valuable. And in fact, they would frown upon that perspective, right? So it depends on how you view it, right? Like I remember a couple years ago reading about like a really uber successful CEO who had written, I want to say it was Elon Musk, like in one of his books, it was like, I sleep in my office, I just have the cot there, and I'm, just working, 22 hours a day kind of thing. Now, there's people that will read that book and view that as a positive trait, okay? But there's other people who look at that and review it as a negative one, right? To give an example, this work-life balance kind of thing. So it depends on how you view it. And so self-esteem is like, is this good or bad? And what I'm suggesting to you is, in terms of like what's healthy for you or like a good sort of just life pro tip, is sometimes there's aspects of our self-esteem where we criticize ourselves for, or we view it as a bad thing, and maybe you just need to reframe it, right? Or use it in a really good way instead of an unhealthy way, right? Or in a bad way, or view it as a bad thing when it could be viewed as a good thing. And you can kind of decide like what aspects are like that, but that could maybe be reframed or viewed in a different way. But self-esteem is basically, is it good or bad, right? Is the trait good or bad? And again, whether it's good or bad is kind of up to you. It's in the eye of the beholder. So you have all three of these concepts that are kind of going on all at once. And obviously, they get influenced heavily ultimately by your intrapersonal communication, the things you're telling yourself, right? Because you're telling yourself, am I these things? Am I good at these things? Are they good or bad? And hey, what, what do I want to throw out there into the world? So that's self-concept, self-esteem, and identity, the differences between the three. And again, they're influenced internally and they're influenced by society. Now, speaking of society, what's going on there? The socialization element. So basically, these are meanings, beliefs basically about what our self-concept is, what we are, what's true, and our self-esteem. Like, should you feel good about that, right? That are conveyed to us by others, others outside of us, right? And they shape all three of those dynamics. So those others are everything from, first of all, they're close influencers. So they're things like your family, your friends, all the way up to then the broader cultures at large, the cultures you belong to, the dominant groups, the subcultures, the minor cultures, right? Government, media, all of these things telling us things about ourselves. Either telling us literally you are this thing or you're capable of this thing, or telling you if you are these things, we don't know what you are, right? Like let's take media. We don't know what you are, but you should want to be this thing, right? This thing's badass, right? Or this thing's good, this thing's bad. And if you're this thing, you're good. And if you're that thing, you're bad, right? Or you should feel bad about it. So if they tell you to feel bad about something, what are they saying? If you believe this is true about you, aka it's in your self-concept, it should lead to a poor self-esteem. You should feel bad about it, right? In terms of how you judge it. So you've got these outside groups that come into play, right? Again, starting with family, then moving on to friends, and then all the way up to the broader culture. And that's everything from media to schools to government to like all of it, right? And more specifically, this term reflected appraisal. This is when you develop a trait of your self-concept and your self-esteem or your identity, right? In other words, what you want to put out there based on what you believe, based on what the way you believe others see you or you want them to see you. So more specifically, the self-concept, self-esteem, this is when you just develop that based on, hey, this is what people are telling me is true, so it's true, right? And then identity, where you start to develop the reflective appraisal is when you basically look at it and go, well, this is what the outside world is telling me to embrace, so I'm going to embrace it, right? And so that's specifically when something external to your intrapersonal communication, when anything in the outside is playing a role in self-concept, self-esteem, and identity, that's reflected appraisal, right? So somebody else has interacted with me this way, treated me this way, sent a certain message to me that is about who I am and whether or not I should feel good or bad about that. Once you internalize that and you accept it as truth, right? Once that becomes gospel, that's reflected appraisal, right? Or in terms of identity, which is, again, what you're putting out to other people, it's when you say, well, the world is telling me this is what to embrace, so this is what I'm going to embrace. Or this is what I see in the world, I like that, so I want to be that, so I'm going to embrace that, right? And so obviously these factors play a role. And in terms of like the socialization part, like when does it bleed in? It's really important in some specific contexts in terms of what the research says. So the first one is when it comes from significant figures. So this is basically opinion shapers, right? This is your family typically. This is your friends typically. This is people you admire, right? Whose opinions you really care about. So any significant figures. It matters a lot with adolescence. So why adolescence and really even early childhood? What's going on there? Well, a lot of that's because when we're growing up, we're forming our identities, right? We're forming our self-concepts, we're forming our self-esteems. A lot of that is we're forming more specifically self-concept and self-esteem, right? What do we think we are? Who do we think it's good or bad, right? What we're becoming and all these sorts, and what we think is true about us. And so that's a really formative time. And so the messages we're getting at that time plays a bigger role, right? So you see a huge impact there. And then anything that involves inclusion and exclusion. So this is basically like, do you belong? Do you fit in? And that kind of goes back to, it's a basic human need. Like you would have heard about this in like psychology classes or discussions on psychology sometimes, this concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So what's Maslow's hierarchy of needs? It's this notion that all human beings have basic needs. Okay, that regardless of where you're at or your situation in life, these are just fundamental um, to all humans. And it starts out at the lowest level. It's things like safety and security and shelter and like the need to survive, essentially, having the stuff you need to survive. And then it moves up, and there's different things, right? Well, one of the needs is basically the need to fit in, belong, be loved, be liked, right? So look, so the social need, is it it's there with everybody. Now, is it the same with everybody? No. Some people have more of a social need than others, right? Like we all know those people that are like social butterflies, and they're very outgoing and they're always in a relationship and they're just really always putting themselves out there. And then there's other people who they like to be alone more often. They do things alone and they're fine being single, and they're less sociable. Does that mean they're Abby normal? Right? To quote Young Frankenstein. Good movie. If you haven't seen it, it's an oldie but goodie. No, it doesn't mean necessarily there's something wrong with you. I mean, could it be a sign of something? Maybe, but not necessarily, right? Some people are just not as sociable as others, right? But here's the deal. Even if you're a little more naturally antisocial, nobody wants to be the troll under the bridge. Nobody wants to be the complete outcast, right? Everybody still wants to fit in to a level, right? And you see that in all kinds of contexts. Okay, so everybody wants to fit in. So anything that involves inclusion and exclusion, like do you belong? Are you appropriately a part of a certain group? Obviously, especially if it's a group you want to belong to, like those messages are really going to likely be internalized a lot.